As sure as the sun will rise, my story ends with my demise. By the time tomorrow arrives, I will no longer be among the living. Throughout my life, I have been known as a kind and compassionate person. If you ask anyone, they will tell you the same. But they will also tell you something else. I have always loved animals more than anything. Since childhood, my home was filled with animals of all kinds. As I grew older, my affection for them only deepened. Feeding and caring for them became my greatest joy. When I married at a young age, I was overjoyed to find that my wife shared my love for animals. She brought the most beautiful creatures into our home: birds, goldfish, a loyal dog, and a magnificent black cat. The cat, whom we named Nero, was unlike any other. He was entirely black, sleek, and highly intelligent. My wife often laughed about the old superstition that black cats were harbingers of bad luck. But to me, Nero was my most cherished companion. He followed me everywhere, so devoted that I often had to prevent him from following me out into the streets. For years we lived in harmony, bound by an unspoken friendship. But time changes all things, and I was not spared. I fell into the grip of a dark vice, alcohol. The more I drank, the less I resembled the man I once was. My kind nature was eroded by anger and selfishness. My patience disappeared. I grew violent, lashing out at those around me, especially my wife. And soon, even my beloved animals were not safe from my wrath. At first, I managed to spare Nero from my drunken fits. But as my sickness deepened, even he could not escape my cruelty. One night, in a drunken stupor, I returned home late to find him avoiding me. This from the animal that once adored me. The rejection stung my wounded pride. I grabbed him, holding him tightly, but he struggled and sank his teeth into my hand. A blind rage took over. I was no longer myself, I was a monster. I pulled a knife from my pocket and, with a swift and terrible motion, I took one of his eyes. The next morning, horror and regret filled me. I could not comprehend my own cruelty. But as the days passed, my remorse faded, drowned by my addiction. Nero, though wounded, survived. But he no longer trusted me. He avoided my presence, scurrying away whenever I came near. First, this broke my heart. But soon my sorrow turned into resentment. I convinced myself that he no longer loved me, and that, somehow, he had wronged me. And so, I did the unthinkable. One evening, driven by an inexplicable force, I took Nero to the garden. With trembling hands and a heart filled with twisted sorrow, I hung him from a tree and watched as life left his body. That night I was startled awake. Smoke filled my lungs. Flames roared around me. The house was on fire. My wife, our servant, and I barely managed to escape before the walls collapsed into ashes. By morning, the house was nothing but ruins, except for one wall that stood untouched. It was an inner wall, covered in fresh plaster. As I approached, I noticed a group of people murmuring in excitement. They stepped aside, revealing the horror that awaited me. Etched in the white plaster was the unmistakable figure of a cat, large, black, and hanging by its neck. Chill ran through me. My mind struggled to rationalize the sight before me. Then I grasped at an explanation. During the fire, someone must have cut Nero's body down and thrown it through a window, attempting to wake me. The heat and smoke pressed his body into the wet plaster, leaving behind the dreadful imprint. Yes, that had to be the reason. And yet, no matter how I tried to convince myself, I could not shake the terror it brought me. That blackened figure haunted me. In the empty corners of my home, in the depths of my dreams, it loomed. And though I tried to bury my guilt, I knew the truth. I had invited darkness into my soul. And it would not leave until it had taken everything from me. But fate had more in store for me. Stricken with grief, I began searching for another cat, one that resembled Nero. I wandered through the dim alleys and grimy taverns of the city, my search fueled by regret and obsession. Then one night, in a run-down drinking house, I noticed something atop a cupboard, a black shape that had not been there before. I reached up and touched it. It was a large black cat, nearly identical to Nero except for one thing, a white mark on its chest. The moment I laid hands on him, he rubbed against me affectionately. This cat seemed drawn to me, just as Nero had once been. He followed me home that night and we kept him. My wife adored him, but I grew to hate him. He was too much like Nero. Too affectionate, too ever-present. Strangely, he had only one eye, just like Nero after my cruel act. The more he followed me, the more my fear of him grew. That white patch on his chest began to change, taking on a more defined shape. And then one day I saw it clearly. It was the shape of the gallows, a symbol of death and judgment. I could find no peace. The cat tormented me, its heavy presence suffocating me in my sleep. Darkness consumed my soul. I loathed everything, including my once beloved wife. One fateful day, as she followed me into the cellar, the cursed cat at my heels, I reached for an axe in blind fury. I swung at the animal, but my wife intervened, grasping my arm. My rage knew no bounds. With a final act of unforgivable cruelty, I turned the axe on her instead, burying it deep into her skull. There was no turning back now. The darkness had won.